Welcome to Outrage Overload, a science podcast about outrage and lowering the temperature. This is episode 78. Social media has been melting down for a while now. The outrage, the misinformation, the way it turns us against one another. And the common wisdom has been, it's the algorithms. Here's Utah Governor Spencer Cox.
Cancer probably isn't a strong enough word. What we have done, especially to our kids, it took us a decade to realize how evil these algorithms are.
And here's Notre Dame computer science professor Tim Winiger.
Social media, they sell more ads and they make more money if people are engaged, and people are more engaged when they're angry. I think that there's roles for the government to play. But I wouldn't call for restrictions in speech or censorship. I think that there's ways you can regulate the algorithm itself without regulating speech.
If we could just fix these recommendation systems, tweak the feed, slow down the engagement machine, then maybe the digital public square could work again. But in a recent Ars Technica interview, researcher Peter Törnberg shared something surprising and a little unsettling. His work shows these problems exist even without the algorithms. Even in the simplest version of social media with no AI-driven feed, you still get polarized tribes, inequality of attention, and the loudest, angriest voices dominating the conversation. In other words, the toxicity we see was baked into the design from the beginning. And now into that ditch enters generative AI. Chatbots, personalized persuasion, systems built not just to shape what we see, but how we think, what we trust, and ultimately, who we become. And that's what we're going to talk about on this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. I'm your host, David Beckmeyer, and today Peter Törnberg joins us to explore that question and to consider what it might take to build digital spaces that are actually good for democracy and for us. By the end of this episode, you're going to have a better appreciation of how these AI systems are shaping you, your decisions, your emotions, your worldview. I promise, your mind is about to be blown. Peter Törnberg, thank you so much for making time for our program.
Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to this. It kind of overlaps with some of my, sort of technical space work, so I'm always excited to have some topics like that.
Yeah, it seems like a super interesting show as well, so interesting to be on.
Oh, thank you. So in the Ars Technica interview, you kind of joked about blowing up social media and kind of good riddance, but then also that we might just find a new ditch. And it sounds pretty dire. So do you think as humans we're just sort of destined to inevitably make these digital spaces unusable?
I don't think the problem is us as humans as such. I think it's more the question of like the broader kind of economic and social context in which these systems are being produced. It is kind of like we're creating this technology that's just fundamentally reshaping our society, our politics and everything. And we're just expecting it to, work out of the box. And it's not even that, right? Like we're shaping it to, extract attention and engagement and data about us. And like we're just fundamentally restructuring global society based on that and expecting it to go well without coming back to it, doing some redesigns and like seeing how that worked out. And we just lack any type of scaffolding, any type of like institutions to handle the negative outcomes and to kind of make adjustments, and if that's the context, then I don't think it's going to work out well.
Yeah, and I definitely want to get to a little bit of some thoughts about what the structure might be different, what we might be able to do differently structurally or in design. But you also talked about this idea that people are retreating into like WhatsApp groups and these closed communities. And does that suggest that this new ditch world might be a space without public square at all? Like, what are the implications for democracy and accountability when all this civic discourse kind of moves into unsearchable closed spaces?
Yeah, no, I think it is a really kind of interesting development we're seeing now. And I just put out today a paper kind of showing how younger people are really starting to leave social media altogether. That is really over the last few years, it's a big jump of people who are just not using any social media, which is understandable, right? Because like platforms like Twitter, Facebook, it's become this like kind of, in part highly polarized, conflictual spaces that are not just very nice to hang out on, but also highly commercialized. It's just mostly kind of AI slop and people trying to like sell you crypto. Like, of course, people don't want to hang out in those spaces anymore. And so what do? Well, they end up fleeing to kind of WhatsApp group or closed group chats, or even these kind of paid services that you follow specific people. And like, it is kind of interesting because we get this kind of bifurcation where platforms like TikTok and so on are becoming this, AI slop, which is not really social media as we used to think about it, right? It's just kind of this audience. It's like television, but very short format and it's more attention extraction. And on the other hand, we have this more kind of private spaces like WhatsApp group that also, I mean, we always spoken about like kind of digital public sphere, right? But this is really digital private sphere coming back again. It kind of is a little bit like, you know, traditional, Habermas wrote about how the television, as a result of the television and broadcast media, we kind of retreated from reading the newspaper aloud in coffee houses and debating in the public sphere to our private sphere, watching television and just discussing television, like whatever's on tonight with our family. And it's kind of that like retreat again. And yeah, it is a bit, I mean, to a certain degree, the ideal of a public sphere, even if the internet never was very, never lived up to that ambition, like it is a very optimistic dream, even if, and this does spell kind of the loss of that. And it also isn't necessarily, a risk, it doesn't necessarily solve the problems of like misinformation and polarization. We've seen in countries like Brazil and India, where WhatsApp is very dominant and it's very based on these kind of small group chats. You still get kind of viral misinformation spreading between these groups. You still get high levels of polarization. So it is kind of, it is really tricky. It also makes it, for us researchers, makes it really hard to study it.
And on that point, your work and others like Jonathan Stray's, which you probably know about, kind of argues that polarization is not really driven by isolation. It's not really sort of the classic filter bubble argument as much as this sort of increased exposure to these distant national political sort of characters. And it talks about how our sphere, Jonathan Stray particularly talks about how our sphere used to be kind of this, it was more local and it was ideologically quirky. So you had, it was harder to develop, to kind of get into an idea bubble because you had enough people with kind of these quirky positions and that was kind of acceptable and normal. And now we can very easily build a very ideologically unified viewpoint, but it's actually people from all over the place. And I don't know if, and I think this architecture of social media, as you kind of demonstrate, but also this new wave of AI stuff seems to be a big player in this. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, we've really seen this, and like a lot of the literature has focused on this kind of echo chamber, right? Like from the 90s on like discussing the problems. And it was very much speaking to this question of like, okay, so the internet is going to be the new public sphere. It's going to enable this like rational deliberation. And then the echo chamber was kind of a counter argument to that to a certain degree, but it was a counter argument that kind of bought into the premise being, we need to have, deliberation. And if we just meet difference, we will deliberate and arrive at kind of a moderate shared position. But if we don't meet difference, if we're just among people who we already agree with, then we don't get that dynamics, and you only hear arguments from one side, and you get this kind of divergence. So it comes from this very kind of rationalistic paradigm, this very kind of pseudo Habermasian understanding of what politics is and what media is. That like it's all just about opinions. We are exchanging arguments, we get opinions, and then we vote on some party based on that. But in the last few years, we've seen kind of a move away, and that's also what I've been part of, kind of arguing that like actually politics it's not just about opinions and arguments. It's not just like rational ideas that's being exchanged, but it has much more to do with kind of community belonging. And like, we speak of affective polarization, that is more like we're part of a football team and we're competing against other football teams. And like the opinions and arguments are kind of secondary. They're kind of downstream of that. We start by choosing our belonging. And then after that, we kind of use that to choose which opinions to have, and then we make up arguments to kind of support those opinions. And so that's the kind of way that I've been trying to understand social media. And I published a book last year with Anton Törnberg, my brother, looking at a Nazi forum from this perspective. And there's also kind of, as you're saying, this kind of nationalization of politics is playing out in that way as well, in the sense that it's a bit of the sense that the kind of the village idiots from every village through this nationalization of media are able to kind of come together and form well, in this case, a Nazi community and through that empower each other and build their own kind of community and their own form of politics. And of course, like, it is into that context that kind of generative AI is entering. And I think what it does is also to further make this space of deliberation and rational exchange, make it even more challenging, right? Like, because we cannot trust anything we see, and we cannot, like, entering into a kind of a deliberative mode in these spaces becomes just harder. And we end up just like not trusting that anything that we receive is like authentic or actually authored by someone. And so it becomes this kind of weirdly postmodern identity space where, you know, nothing matters and we can't trust anything. And so it just becomes this, this AI slop really that doesn't have any meaning, and it's just entertainment. And instead we're just existing in the world based on identity, belonging, and emotion in a way that becomes, I think, really dangerous for society.
Yeah, you know, and right, and that made me think about how, you know, you have one thing we know about when you when you build these kind of virtual worlds like that, where you've got this kind of conformity and uniformity, you have this misperception that everybody thinks like me. Like, then I must be like sort of in the mainstream. I'm like representing like most of the people, because you can kind of do that for any topic. You can build a network like that, and AI feeds that even more because of all this sycophancy, right? It's like, oh, that's a great idea. Everything's a great idea to AI, right? Now you're on the right track, right? And I think that's another challenge here is and that makes us. It makes it hard to really interact with people, because your mind is sort of blown when you find out you actually have a very fringe view and these other people don't get it. Like, like, how do they not get it? Like, it's so normal. Talk to my friends online and you'll see.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's this sense of epistemic closure that we have. Like, we get very sure of our opinions, and there are these new studies on kind of AI and the effects of sycophancy that are showing precisely this kind of closure of like, we get kind of stronger opinions and we become more convinced about our opinions and less kind of epistemically open. And I think that this is really the landscape that we're seeing developing right now, right? Like, the social media platforms are becoming reduced to these kind of battlefields of AI swarms representing different interests, trying to convince us of something, arguing with each other. And, you know, it's also creating this kind of novel form of kind of, AI filter bubbles or echo chambers in some way, in the sense that, like, we have a specific AI that's just tailored to our opinions and interests, and is based on trying to reinforce what we like to hear, you know. And I mean, it's been a big kind of focus in the AI industry, this kind of focus on how we can pursue personalization, and which I think is slightly different from sycophancy. And maybe most, you know, we see kind of Elon Musk's Grok as being one of the example where it's kind of like using alignment as a form of power and as a form of like convincing people. And I think it's just, we're still seeing it taking shape, this kind of battlefield, but I think that will really be the battlefield that is characterizing the coming years, is this kind of the way that AI becomes a kind of form of political power to shape our interests or our understanding and our positions and our worldviews in a way that is even more profound and I think even more dangerous than social media was to our politics and our society.
Yeah, I mean, being on the sort of the tech side of it, I guess, or kind of having grown up in the sort of tech world and watched all these sort of innovations that are always like, oh, this one's going to solve the world for sure, all the world's problems for sure. We go in very naively thinking, we may have had a good idea about it, but then we kind of, but then people actually use it this other way and it didn't turn out that way. There's so many folks I'm seeing that are like, oh, but I don't even go to Google anymore. I just take the AI answer, and of course there's a lot of reporting on this that people aren't clicking the links anymore. They're just taking the first thing that Google shows at the top. And, that's a lot of power, right? To go say whatever they want there. And if people believe it, like, Googling's like, that's the old way. Now I just ask ChatGPT, right? And that sounds great, sort of. But, again, you're back to this. That's a lot of power as to what these LLMs are fed with and sort of who's behind it and all that kind of stuff, right? You're back to this whole new world. And if people just trust that implicitly, that's kind of a scary world.
Yeah. I think it's also like we should be kind of like it's good to have a sense of where we are in the kind of tech bubble, so to speak. And I would say that we are kind of where the internet was in like 99, or where where the platform bubble was in 2016 or something, when we all had like what's been referred to as like millennial lifestyle subsidy, because the platforms were just trying to take over the market. So Uber rides were like extremely cheap and subsidized. Delivery food was subsidized by Silicon Valley and so on. And it was always like, oh, this is great. Everyone was like quite excited about it before the kind of enshittification, once we're kind of locked in and they're trying to turn it into like a way of actually extracting capital from us, actually extracting rents somehow. And with platform, that just meant, okay, taxis don't really exist anymore. We're kind of locked into using Uber, and now suddenly the prices are really high and the service is really, it's been referred to as enshittification, right? In looking at AI, now we're really in this happy place where, our cheating on homework and doing our office work is kind of subsidized by venture capital, but it will turn, right? It will shift to when these companies, which are the very same companies that turned couch surfing into Airbnb, like that turned, the happy social media of 2010 into the current Facebook or X. When these companies are seeing how they can use the powers of these technologies to extract rents to make as much money as possible, and it's very clear how this kind of alignment and the kind of way of shaping culture, shaping our reasoning, shaping like very fundamental processes of society. They are now under the control of these companies throughout society. I mean, we saw, U.S. military officials using ChatGPT to make decisions, and obviously it's happening everywhere. And like, it's an enormous amount of power situated in these companies. I'm running an experiment right now where we're together with Juliana Schweri, we're looking at how AI chatbots are affecting how people are writing. So they get like the task to write some essay or analyze some topic, and have a chatbot to help them do so. And the chatbot is trying to manipulate them to manipulate what they're going to write, and seeing whether people are able to notice it. And I mean, it's pretty clear that they're not, right? And it has really powerful ways of shaping what people are saying without them noticing, and they feel more confident and feel like I wrote this, I said this. And even like possibly changing their views and changing their opinions in the process. So it's really scary, the amounts of power that is really in this, and that is I think not being debated in a real way.
Yeah, and if you've been through some of these cycles from the inside, as I have, and it sounds like as you have, like this is very obvious what's happening, right? And when I talk to people about a lot of these sort of things we have to keep in mind, they're like, oh, you're just a Luddite, you don't get it. Here, let me show you how to use ChatGPT the right way or whatever. It's like, no, I don't think we're quite on the same page about what my conversation is here, is because, they're obviously trying to get us hooked on it, right? I mean, I see people, kind of using the free version, and the little thing comes up and says, oh, you can't use it till 2 p.m. And they're like jonesing for it, like for their next hit. I can't go back on the ChatGPT for 2 hours or whatever, right? And you see these behaviors. It looks very much like an addiction, right? And so it's clearly they're trying to get us really hooked on it, that we won't be able to do the way we used to do it. It's almost like we can't drive around anymore without a GPS. I mean, even to get to like grandma's house that we've been to 1,000 times, we put it in the GPS for some reason, right? And and I feel like that's a big thing that's happening here with the AI stuff is they're really trying to get us hooked on it because, like you say, right now it's just big. There's just so much money dumping out of VC to pay for all this. But as you say, at some point it's going to have to be paid for. There's also a lot of rainforest trees being dumped into this to pay for it as well, and that's going to have other effects through our economy and elsewhere in our whole lives. But you can see that's what's happening, right? It's all over again. It's the same pattern, only this time it feels even bigger, right? I mean, because it's like you say, it's kind of seeping in to so many parts of our lives, and it does have a massive amount of power. And that's very interesting, the idea that you could definitely see that happening quite easily with this idea of kind of changing your views in a subtle way, interacting with it, it could probably take you almost wherever it wants to take you.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting in some ways because I think there was an argument to be made that the previous cycle, or maybe the previous cycles, that there was a lot of, hype way beyond what was actually supported. So like, for instance, this notion of like surveillance capitalism, the Zuboff idea, that platforms extract our data from Facebook and so on, and they can like shape our behavior in detail. It's like behavioral modification at scale. And my view is that a lot of those narratives were really overstated. Of course, there was huge privacy concerns, and of course, the platform capitalists it reshaped the internet, it reshaped our culture in really often very problematic ways. But I think that in my sense, it did so without actually being able to deliver the thing that it was supposed to deliver, which is, ads and making us actually purchase things. I don't think it was there's not much evidence to show that it was actually very efficient at doing so. But I think that while I'm not saying that there's not a lot of hype around AI, there certainly is. It's also clear that it's such a powerful technology. It's such a powerful technology in shaping our behavior and influencing, manipulating us and controlling us in different ways. And so my concerns are somehow much larger than it was even around surveillance capitalism, platform capitalism, which did undoubtedly have terrible consequences for our politics and society.
Yeah, exactly. And like I was saying, there's a little bit of this. There's almost like a culture being formed of like, this is so great. Like, you just have to see, I've got a secret about ChatGPT and I'm going to teach you about it. So you'll see how wonderful it is. And there's this whole movement like that everybody thinks, oh, if you're not using it, then you're just not getting it. Like, oh, let me show you how to use it the right way. And, and that's almost like that's going to be hard to quell, right? Because if everybody kind of believes they're on this wonderful track, and that's going to be very hard to sort of turn that around and without them thinking like, oh, you're just a Luddite. Circling back a little bit to social media again, and your work, I think, showed us that even without an algorithm, you basically, with these very minimal environment, this core dysfunction of these platforms kind of surfaces. Can you kind of give us a rough overview of what that core dysfunction is or what it looks like?
Yeah. I mean, so what we did in this study, we were looking at kind of three outcomes that have been discussed as like the reason why social media is so problematic for society. The first one is kind of, echo chambers, this idea that we're not meeting disagreement. And of course, like as we've already said, we can kind of debate on the extent to which we're completely isolated from disagreement. But, we do need to have interaction with diverse interaction for society to kind of function, right? And the second one is the kind of the inequality of attention, because what we've seen somewhat paradoxically is that social media tends to create these influencers that completely dominate discourse, that become extremely powerful and just completely control discourse, whereas like 99% get very few likes, very few shares, very little attention. And then finally, that we have a very strong correlation between how loud, how aggressive, how polarized, how partisan someone is, and how much attention they're getting, which leads to this kind of misrepresentation of what politics is that can be really dangerous for society, and that can itself lead to polarization. So those are the kind of three outcomes that we are measuring, and we're using that, looking at the kind of network structure and like looking at who's getting attention and so on these platforms and who is interacting. And even with this kind of minimal, so what we find in the studies, even though with the most minimal platform, without any, engagement algorithms and so on, these three outcomes are still produced by social media. And so why is this the case? Is the kind of obvious question, right? And what we find is that so we have this kind of liking, sharing, and following. Those are it's like the minimal network. That's the only things that we've built into this platform. And what we find is that like people tend to retweet. You don't retweet something is I feel mad about it. Like this is like you retweet emotionally. It's like something you do. You share something because it's like it makes you react. Often it makes you angry. It makes you outraged. That's the ones that like it's a very partisan decision. So that's something that we already know, that culture and social media tends to overrepresent certain content. But what our model is kind of adding to that is the fact that that also shapes who we tend to follow, because we tend to encounter material through sharing, through kind of retweeting, and so because those are the individuals that show up on our timeline, and then we kind of go in and we read their posts and we start following them. And so the result of that is that we get a kind of feedback process between this highly partisan, like outrage-driven decision to share content and followership, which means that the network that's being produced itself becomes kind of toxic, becomes outrage-driven. So that becomes built into the very structure of these networks, even without any algorithms. Of course, that doesn't mean that the algorithms aren't making matters worse, right? It's very likely that they can still make matters worse, but it does mean that it's not enough to reduce social media to this minimal networks and to reduce or remove the algorithms, that we might need to do something a little bit more radical.
Well, I guess what would that more radical be is the next place to go then.
Yeah, no, I mean that's the $1 million question, right? I mean, I think that there's like so one thing I have to say about that is that like it is a little bit funny that we kind of consider, so we have kind of one social media platform. When we talk about social media and the ideal social media, we envision it as being kind of one platform, right? But it's also the case that we're using social media and our society needs a lot of very different functions. And it's not clear to me that those functions could all be supported by the same type of platform, right? And so often we're talking about, like deliberation and this kind of rational exchange and arguments. That's the kind of ideal picture, I mean, which comes in part from Habermas and so on, about what social media should be. But like the question is like, is that really the main activity that people want to spend their day with? I think it's an important activity, but I think it's one out of several activities. And I think a lot of the problem is that we've mixed that activity together with what is actually the opposite of that activity, which is kind of community building and identity formation and this emotional kind of exchange, which I think is very important. It has very important psychological functions in society for building societal cohesion, for feeling belonging and so on. The problem is that when you mix politics into that, it can become dangerous. It can have really problematic outcomes. And so and the same thing, like keeping up with news and learning things is another important function in society. That again, I think we should be careful mixing that with kind of community emotion building processes, because that obviously can lead to reading information and production of partisan information that can be problematic. And we have this kind of, I don't know, like hobbies, like there's a lot of different things. And I think that maybe we need to start thinking about like, how do we create different platforms to support different activities? And I think even more importantly, like, how do we think about like the kind of scaffolding, the kind of institutions that are able to produce these platforms, keep a kind of oversight over them, and somehow make sure that it doesn't, it doesn't produce some kind of terrible societal outcomes. Because currently we don't have that feedback process. We have a feedback process where companies are trying to make as much money as possible, extract as much data as possible, and have quite limited interest in the kind of societal consequences of these platforms. And like for us in this society, we view that as being kind of the only way of doing this it's the only way, but it's really, it's a hell of a way to run a railroad in some ways, and it's not something natural. If you would ask, I'm from Sweden, if you would ask a Swedish person in like the 80s even, like how we would manage this type of system, like saying that we would let private companies run it would be just they would think you're insane, it's like we used to have a lot of other ways of managing shared infrastructures, and especially infrastructures that's kind of crucial for the function of society. That's not leaving it to large monopolistic companies that are using it for profit making in very destructive ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we miss out here in the United States is we have this very strong sort of First Amendment idea of free speech and all that, but we often like see that as kind of a penalized mode, like somehow that's what it's about, that side of it, rather than being sort of this. There was the original idea was like there would be this proactive side of it that would help build these kind of institutions and things like that. To better society, and I think we've completely lost that side of our First Amendment here. That nobody sees that role of it. So anyway, that's a direction that was a lot. There's been people a lot smarter than me write about that. That I think somehow we've completely lost that, and it's probably going to be hard to get it back because it's become this other thing now that's hard to deal with. So I want to talk a little bit about. There's a lot of people in this sort of bridge building world that I'm kind of part of now. They're kind of talking about AI for good. This kind of idea. Can we somehow flip the script? That if the old architecture is sort of doomed and we need new stuff, and we're hearing all the sort of horror stories about how AI could really be dangerous, and it definitely could be, all the stuff you're talking about and other stuff we've talked about. But what do you think about this idea of AI for good? Is that sort of just kind of a pipe dream, or is there some potential there?
No, I do think that there is a lot of potential. I mean, there's a bunch of interesting experiments coming out of this, in part by colleagues of mine, like Chris Bale, who've run these kind of studies of like having AI kind of moderate conversations between people, and like maybe if you don't call them an a-hole, they will react better, and like maybe you can rephrase this like this. And that it produces really, productive and useful outcomes, and that it does help. And so I could very much see, that being part of conversations. And I mean, to a certain degree, having people take moderating roles, it's not, it's not completely new in a certain degree. And there's even some studies suggesting that, it can kind of help us see difference and see the humanity in others, to help us kind of reflect and pause. I mean, it is an extremely powerful technology, and so of course it can lead to very different outcomes. We can use it as part of infrastructures that support democracy and support constructive conversations. The question again is kind of like, we still need the kind of superstructures for that. We need something that's not just the profit motives of platform companies that are trying to lock us into ecosystems and extract rent and so on, and use the kind of powers of these technologies to for a form of rentierism. Like in that kind of context, I have a hard time seeing how such systems would take off. And because it's not always, I mean, this is a lot of what I'm studying now, is this kind of question of, can things be engaging? Can they be fun? Can they be places that we choose to go into without having negative outcomes, and like actually having some positive consequences? Is that possible? Because that's like kind of the space that we need to be in. And currently, what we're optimizing for is kind of data extraction and engagement extraction. With those constraints, I really doubt that it's possible to build healthy environments. But these environments that were developed so far, it's not something that people have chosen to do. They're getting paid to use them.
Right. And right. I mean, it's like somehow we have to feed something that's as healthy as broccoli, but make it taste like ice cream. Yeah, because we say we want the broccoli, but we never actually want the broccoli. Well, I guess on that a little bit, I just want to dive a little bit into that. Of all the pro-social interventions your team tested, are there any that were promising?
So we tried basically, yeah, a bunch of fairly radical interventions on this minimal platform to try to see, and there's been a drawing on the literature, and we did kind of a review, like a survey of what people have been suggesting in the literature. And of course, like thus far, they've all been kind of theoretical suggestions because it's really hard to kind of create a platform and then, run these experiments. And so our simulation kind of allows us to do that. But we were, yeah, quite disappointed with the results. So you like whatever we tried it off, like even if it has a kind of a slightly positive effect on one of the dimensions we're looking at, it kind of had often a negative effect on another. And so it's none of them really worked that well. And I would say also that we took quite radical approach to it. Like we didn't care about this engagement or it being fun or anything. It was like one of the interventions, basically we show the least interesting post, like the least liked post, the least shared post first. And so try to address this kind of inequality of attention. And like it had a small effect on the inequality of attention, but it also led to more partisan, angrier posts getting more attention. And so, yeah, it was basically we were quite disappointed because this was supposed to be the kind of optimistic paper where we like tried to actually show that these problems can be solved within the framework of a kind of traditional network-based social media platform. And I think our takeaway was that it's not really the case.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I'm always trying to do episodes where we close on a high note, and I'm not completely convinced we can do that today. But I mean, one of the things you said about kind of maybe segregating some of the functions into different systems is potentially an avenue. But I keep coming back, like you were talking about, if the motive is all kind of about profit and attention. It's kind of fundamentally going to be, that's like a blocker, like we can't go anywhere from that. And I think about like this bridge movement space, and probably if you added up all the money that all these organizations combined have, it's probably like $30 million or something, right? And you look at like NVIDIA's valuation went up like what, $1 trillion in the last 6 months or something. So it's like there's an inequality there that it is going to be a challenge. I mean, I don't know. Again, we come back to this as long as it stays with those incentives and try, certainly, and I think in most of the free world, if you say, well, we have to stop this business, that's going to be seen as very much, that's going to be too obtrusive or intrusive to, free markets and all that. So it'd be very hard to say, well, the government's going to force all these companies to stop doing that. So, and again, bottom up means we have to sort of do it for ourselves. And again, I come back to kind of the broccoli analogy thing. We tend to go the other way more often. So I don't know. With all that kind of as a setup, would you have any thoughts on that, or can you maybe lead us maybe some little bit of hope somewhere?
I mean, what I would say is that we kind of take for granted the way we're structuring our economy and this idea that these like huge corporations trying to kind of lock us into ecosystem to like extract rents from us and kind of, that which is like not really beneficial for anyone, and that they're inventing technologies not because it's beneficial for humanity, but because they want to attain this type of power to extract rents. It's a mad way of organizing a society, right? It's kind of crazy, and it didn't always used to be that, and we definitely didn't used to take it for granted. And I think fundamentally, I think if anything that I'm optimistic about is the fact that things can change. We tend to not recognize how society could be different, and that those changes can actually happen quite quickly. So that would be my kind of optimism, the kind of fact that more and more people are like realizing that this is really a crazy way of organizing a society and organizing where we as a society put our resources, and that can lead to change, even if obviously that is made more challenging by the fact that that change often needs to be organized in the spaces that are owned by the companies that we're trying to resist, right? But I think that we are currently in a kind of pivot moment. We're seeing the ways that social media was organized and a lot of ways that a lot of aspects of society was organized are kind of breaking down. And those pivot points are always, windows of opportunity where we can change things and we can develop things in a different direction.
Right. I mean, kind of paraphrasing a lot of the sort of folks that talk about this, this idea that it can feel like it can't change and it can never change until it sort of does. And often it happens really quickly once it starts to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Peter Törnberg, thank you so much for making time for our program today. I could definitely chat with you for 5 more hours, I'm sure, because this is some awesomely interesting stuff. But I know I got to let you go, but I really appreciate you making the time for us.
Thank you. It was really great chatting with you.
That is it for this episode of the Outrage Overload podcast. For links to everything we talked about on this episode, go to outrageoverload.net. If something in this episode sparked a thought, or maybe even lit a fire, I'd love to hear from you. You can leave a voice message or even schedule a quick one-on-one chat right from our contact page at outrageoverload.net/contact. If you found this episode valuable, please share it or leave a review. It really helps. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.